Hey guys, welcome back. We're going to go into our last part of experiments here in observational studies. So the difference between those two. I've actually got a pretty cool story today about Botox. So I was watching a commercial, I think I was watching the OSU game, and they had a lot of commercials about Botox and talking about reducing migraines. And in my mind, I remember Botox as being a cosmetic surgery. So I asked my uncle about it, and he actually told me a story about how they found out that Botox, it started out, of course, as a cosmetic surgery thing, and then they found out that it actually reduces headaches and migraines, and so now they actually use it for a therapeutical instead of just for cosmetics, which is pretty cool. And actually kind of goes along and tells a story of the difference between an observational study and an experiment. So an observational study, if you remember, is when we notice trends. So we'll kind of go to this slide first. So we're not actively manipulating anything. We're not assigning random treatment groups, assigning individuals to random treatment groups. Nothing, no manipulation going on at all. We're just observing trends in nature. And then once we notice a trend, meaning there is an association, we design an experiment where we control certain factors and we design levels of those factors in order for us to analyze the results at the end after they've been randomly assigned to see if it was truly those factors that were at play that were what caused the increase in the response variable or decrease that we were looking for. So that would be the difference between an observational study, which is just observing a trend in nature, and an experiment where we're randomly assigning people in treatment groups. That way we can prove that it was the treatment that actually caused the improvement and not just some other lurking variable in play. So in the study of adults who had chronic migraine headaches, a shot of Botox cut the number of days they had them, or even other types of headaches. They also had more crystal clear, pain-free days each month than reported fewer days off work. In another study, nearly half the people who took 2 rounds of Botox shots reported the number of days that they had a headache each month was cut in half. After 5 rounds of treatment, that increased to about 70% of the people. So it seemed to be very effective. So what they found out, doctors think that Botox works for migraine headaches because it blocks the chemicals called neurotransmitters that carry pain signals from your brain. So Botox is a roadblock in the pathway. It stops chemicals before they get to the nerve endings around your head and your neck. So it started out as an observational study where they had a lot of these people were taking Botox, I'm assuming women, in like the mid 1990s, so 1995 around then. And the women who had a lot of headaches and migraines before, they all of a sudden, after taking Botox for cosmetic reasons, they realized that their migraines were going away. From that information, from the observational study, right, they designed an experiment, and they were able to show that whenever they took people with chronic migraines and issues like that, the ones that were randomly assigned to be given Botox, they found increased about 70% of the people, or the number of headaches was cut in half, or whatever, however they measured it, whatever metric they used. They saw it was statistically significant, meaning this couldn't have just happened by chance of random variation from sampling to sample, but rather they believed that it was the Botox itself that was causing the improvements. So anyway, really cool story. I hope you guys enjoyed that one. We'll move on. So we have 2 different types of observational studies. We have retrospective and prospective. So retrospective is usually used with rare diseases. The benefit is that it's easy to, once the disease has already been established, it's easy to find those people where we don't have to select people and then hope somebody gets a rare disease, which is not likely to happen. But the downsides to that is we're looking at medical records and logs, are going off their memory to try to remember what was going on to find that pattern. The prospective studies have a benefit. We select the people, the participants, and then we let them do their own natural thing. We don't randomly assign them to anything that they wouldn't normally do, but we do have them take logs of all the things that they did, whatever we might be interested in. So that would be a prospective study. So there are ways that we reduce variation that we would have from sampling to sampling. If we think there was a difference between opinions or heights or whatever based on age, sex, race, income, or any other demographic, or really anything, then in sampling, we would stratify. So we would break them down and do separate samples of men and women, or break them down by sex, race, or income, or anything else that we thought might cause more variation. If we thought in experiments, if we thought there was a difference in these, we would block the experiment, kind of run parallel experiments for 2 different age groups, or by sex, or so maybe we do like 4th graders and 5th graders or whatever. So that would be block. We would block it, run two different parallel ones. Same thing if we thought that it differed by race or by income, like socioeconomic status or anything like that. And then in observations, we're not randomly assigning anything. It's all just natural trends, but we can like pick somebody who was let's say a fourth grade female middle class white girl who chose to do orchestra and a fourth grade middle class white girl who chose not to do music, and compare the GPAs of those two. Okay, and in doing that, even though we weren't randomly assigning anything, we could still match the observations together in case there was other factors at play. So if we matched all of our people together based on their age, sex, race, or income, or whatever, and then we can see what the average increase was for those who chose to do music versus those who chose not to do music, we still couldn't prove that it was the music itself, but we would be able to reduce a lot of variation if there was changes in the GPA by age, by sex, race, or income, or something like that, which we would expect to see. So anyway, that's called matching. We'll actually have an example of matching in an experiment as well. But blocking is when we run separate experiments. Matching is whenever we use the same person and match them up. Match the results with two different treatment groups. We just run the experiment again with the same person, just a different treatment group. So we'll get into that today in our example. So there was an example where a teacher, a stat teacher in college, wanted to know, does the teacher's tone affect the student's performance? So they took all their stat students. The factor was whether or not was the tone. The levels were monotone and enthusiasm. So kind of sounds like fun. So he taught one class monotone, Bueller. The other one was with enthusiasm, and maybe talked with his hands more, used more inflections in his voice, which I hope I do. Anyway, then at the end, he either used teacher evaluations or academic grades to see the performance of the students, however he decided to measure that. There were a few things that he was concerned about. So for instance, what if there was a difference between the students' performance in the spring or in the fall? So maybe the weather had to change that. So maybe students did better whenever it was warmer outside, or maybe it was warmer outside, so then they had more distractions because they were up playing sand volleyball pretty much every night, like I did when I was in college, or AM or PM. So if they were morning classes or PM classes, you have different types of students that take morning or PM classes. So maybe that could be an issue, or maybe they're half asleep in the morning and not so much in the afternoon, so maybe there's benefit in that. So what we want to do is to block this experiment and run multiple ones, or change the way that you do it halfway through the semester and match up the same students from the first half of the semester into the second half of the semester once you changed it with them. So lots of different ways to do that. Let's go ahead and look at the assignment, so not too much to do. Number 12 is dioxin. So researchers had linked an increase in the incidence of breast cancer in Italy to dioxin released by an industrial accident in 1976. Okay, so the study found 981 women who lived near the site of the industrial accident that were under the age of 40 at the time. 15 of the women had developed breast cancer at an unusually young average age of 45 years old. Medical records show that they had a heightened concentrations of dioxin in the blood, that the tenfold increase in dioxin level were associated with doubling the risk of breast cancer. So that was the overall kind of result stat that they found. So a tenfold increase in dioxin level doubled the risk of breast cancer. And also they had an abnormally young age for breast cancer, or women with breast cancer at the age of 45. All right, so first thing we want to see is whether this was a retrospective or prospective observational study or an experiment. Well, the first thing, the easy thing to rule out is the experiment part. We're not randomly assigning some women to have exposure to dioxin or in their blood or anything like that. So that would be unethical. We're not going to do that, right? So this is not an experiment. This is rather going to be an observational study. So it was an incident that had already happened. We were just looking back on looking at all the women who were in the area and seeing which one of those had developed at this point, breast cancer, and then Yeah, so we're looking back at their medical records as well with their blood levels to see their levels of dioxin in their blood. So this would actually be a retrospective. So we already started out, we already knew the women who had cancer in that region and all the other women who were in that region, and then we looked back at their medical records. So again, kind of like with any rare disease, we're going to use a retrospective. It's going to end up being retrospective. All right, the subjects that were studied and how they were selected. So that was the 981 women who lived near the site of the incident who were under the age of 40. We didn't choose the ones who were over the age of 40 because then clearly they would have they would be more likely to have developed breast cancer based on natural causes, just in general population of women that I guess suppose on average develop breast cancer after the age of 45. Okay, parameter of interest. So this is from our population parameter. It's the parameter which is like a statistic that we're interested in, but it's the overall one. So we're looking at rates or incidences of breast cancer. So what is the risk of breast cancer among women? And if you were talking about the population, we could be talking about just the population. I mean, our sample strictly came from this industrial accident in this region of Italy. But if we were also talking about dioxin levels in the rest of the world, we could actually expand our population to the rest of the world. So just we're just looking at rates or risk levels of breast cancer across the world based on dioxin levels wherever that might exist. However, we would have to be careful because perhaps the genetics of these women in Italy were different than genetics of women somewhere else in the world, and so maybe the dioxin wouldn't have the same effect. So we really probably should limit the scope of our conclusions to just talking about women in Italy. The nature and the scope of the conclusions. Okay, so the nature, was this a study or an experiment? Well, it was just a study, just that we observed a trend in nature. And so the scope of the conclusion is we can show that there's an association between the two, but we can't prove that dioxin was the cause of it. There could be other lurking variables in play here. Without a carefully designed experiment with random assignment of treatment groups, we cannot prove a causal relationship. We can't prove that it was the dioxin that did it. So we would actually have to, kind of like the Botox thing, we'd have to go back and create an experiment to be able to prove that. But we're not going to be able to do that because it's unethical. If we actually think that dioxin increases, like doubling the risk of breast cancer, we're not going to, submit a woman to that or something like that. So if we did it with lab rats or something like that, then maybe, but PETA would be upset, PETA. All right, 14, herbal remedy. Scientists at a major pharmaceutical firm investigated the effectiveness of an herbal compound to treat the common cold, so like cough drops. They exposed each subject to a cold virus and then gave him or her either the herbal compound or a sugar solution known to have no effect on the cold, which would be like a placebo, right, or a sugar pill. Several days later, they assessed the patient's condition using a cold severity scale ranging from 0 to 5. So the patient is kind of self-reporting 0 to 5. They found no evidence of the benefits associated with the compound. So that would be kind of like their conclusion that they came up with. So maybe there was a slight benefit, but it wasn't statistically significant, meaning it wasn't unusual enough or different enough, or the effect size, the difference between the two ratings were not large enough for a sample that size for us to think that it couldn't have just occurred by random sampling variation. All right, so was this a retrospective or a prospective observational study or an experiment? Well, in this one, they're assigning them either herbal compound or the sugar solution. They do not mention randomization, so they didn't mention that if they had a choice of which one they got or if it was randomly assigned or anything like that. So we could assume it, but they should mention that. So did they know? I mean, what's the point of having a sugar solution or placebo if you're not going to be randomizing it, comparing it? So why would you have people there in the first place if they knew what was going on? So I would say it was an experiment that they were randomly assigned, but they need to mention whether or not it actually was randomly assigned. The subjects that were studied are going to be the volunteers in this case. Just whoever those volunteers were. And the factors of the experiment. So the factor is going to be basically a treatment or an herbal compound with two levels. You have the one that's the actual herbal compound. The second level would be the placebo, which is like a control group, like no treatment group, in other words. The factors of the experiment. So yeah, there was one factor, which was the herbal compound at two levels. So either full dose of herbal compound or no herbal compound and substituting a placebo. So all together, that would be one factor at 2 levels, which would be 1 times 2, which is a number of 2 treatments. So that part's pretty simple. All right, then the response variable measured, what are we interested in this case? So that's going to be the patient's condition using a cold severity scale rating from 0 to 5. So it's kind of nice to give us the numbers as well. The design, was it completely randomized, blocked, or matched? So in this case, we weren't using the same person and giving them one of each and randomly assigning, did they get the herbal compound or the placebo first? That would be matched if we use the same person, which would be actually a really good way of doing it, because then we would control for all the other factors there, except the fact that once somebody already had the cold virus, maybe their body would fight it off better to the second one. So, but if we did our experiment, we kind of switched the order of whether we did the placebo first or the placebo second, that would actually change. We would actually be able to measure that. So if everyone got better the second time, even though they had placebo the second time or whatever, then that would actually suggest or show that it wasn't actually the herbal compound that got better. It was the fact that they had already fought off the virus before, and so they kind of built up an immunity to it. So anyway, kind of cool thinking about this stuff. By the way, if you're really kind of struggling with all this experiment stuff, there are entire courses in college. Of course, I didn't take them, but there are courses in college that are all for an entire semester, and all it's about is experimental design. And so designing a very good experiment is what makes you a good scientist or mathematician or whatever. And really, this is what's great about statistics, is that it is a math course, but yeah, it applies to so many different fields, including engineering and all science fields and manufacturing and business and stuff like that. So it's really important to know these things. Anyway, so I hope you guys will enjoy this class. And I actually talked to a former student of mine who took a stat class in college. And she told me that while her professor was teaching, she kept remembering all the things and the pictures and the images from, I guess, from these videos or whatever that I had taught her, and that's why she was able to be successful in the class. So that's kind of flattering. All right, so the response variable measured, again, was a patient's condition. Was it completely randomized? They didn't mention randomized, so hopefully it was randomized when they randomly assigned the treatments. Also, it would be a good idea to match them if you could. Again, you could have some issues with that. We're not blocking it by anything like sex, where we do different with male or female. We're not blocking by age. Maybe we thought that. That would differ or cause more variation. Younger people fight it out better or would be worse. We don't know with the cold. So they didn't mention it, so we don't really know. Was it blind or double blind? So did the participants know? I guess they gave them one or the other. The whole point of having a placebo is that they wouldn't know, so we would assume it would at least be blind. Was it double blind? Was the person who was giving it like a medical professional or the person evaluating? Well, in this case, the person evaluating was not a medical professional. The person evaluating it was just the person himself. So it's not really possible, I think, in this one to be double blind because the evaluator is the same person who's is the participant. So not possibly to be double blind. The nature and the scope of the conclusion. So was this an experiment with random assignment, or was this merely an observational study? So if we did randomly assign the treatment groups, then we could actually prove a causal relationship. But if you look at their conclusion, there was no evidence of benefits associated with the compound. We kind of override that. So basically we would be able to conclude that it was not, the herbal compound was not effective at treating the cold virus. So that would be our conclusion. 36, swimming. Recently, a group of adults who swam regularly for exercise were evaluated for depression. It turns out that these swimmers were less likely to be depressed than the general population. The researchers said that the difference was statistically significant. The statistically significant means that the difference that we observed in the rates. So let's say they have a depression level rating from 0 to 5, okay? So the general population would, let's say, they would give an average of 2.5, which is right smack dab in the middle. But for the swimmers, they had, let's say, an average depression level of 2. Now that 0.5 difference, depending on how big of a sample it is, if it's a small sample, then that could have just occurred because we only sampled 5 people or 10 people, right? But if we sampled 100 people, then all of a sudden that difference of 0.5 could actually be statistically significant, where we believe that because of it's not within the margin of error, that it's not possible that this occurred by chance, that there actually is some benefit or from this group of swimmers, that they're less likely to suffer from depression than the general population. Okay, so what does statistically significant mean in this context? It simply means that it's unlikely to have occurred by chance or by random sampling variation. I know that sounds confusing, but once we get into statistical inference in the second semester, you'll do better. So all you need to know for now is statistically significant means unlikely to have occurred by chance. So for instance, if I flip a coin 10 times and I get 8 heads out of 10, that would be statistically significant, which would cause me to believe that maybe the coin was weighted or something like that, because it was unlikely to have occurred by chance. And this experiment, is this an experiment or observational study? So we already started out with these group of adults who swam regularly, right? We weren't taking a group of adults and then randomly assigning some of them to swim and some of them not to swim. So this is an observational study where we're just allowing people to naturally swim who already like to swim, and then we take the general population and we don't force them to swim or anything like that. So this is just merely an observational study. So all we can say is that we saw a general trend or an association between people who swam and lower levels of depression, which is fine as long as we're not overstating our case and saying there was a causal relationship and saying, hey, if you start swimming, that'll decrease your chances of depression or the levels of depression severity or something like that. So you got to be very, very careful. A lot of times people will overstate their conclusions in the scope of the study. All right, the news reported the claim, of course, naturally, what we're leading into. News reports claim the study proved that swimming can prevent depression. Again, not a causal relationship, wasn't an experiment, so we can't go that route. We can say there's an association between the two, but we don't know if it was actually the swimming that caused the lower rates of depression. Explain why this conclusion is not justified by a study. Again, it was a study, not an experiment. There was no random assignment, so we can't prove a causal relationship. Include an example of a possible lurking variable. So you could have people, it could be a wealth thing, right? So people who can afford to swim, I'm sure, you got to have a big pool to be able to do that or whatever, or to be able to pay a membership to some place like the Y that actually has a big pool. Maybe people who are wealthy are less likely to struggle with depression. Not sure, just could be a possible lurking variable, right? Another one is perhaps people who are depressed, so it could just be backwards, right? If you're depressed, you're less likely to exercise or swim regularly. So it's not that the exercise fought off the depression, is that the depression fought off the exercise. So you'd be less likely to stick with your hobbies and stuff that makes you have fun and make you more want to stay in bed and not get up, stuff like that. Okay, so part D. But perhaps it is true. We wonder if exercise can ward off depression and whether anaerobic exercise like weight training or resistance training is as effective as aerobic exercises like swimming. We find 120 volunteers not currently engaged in a regular program of exercise. That's this guy right here. Suppose you suspect the male and female participants will respond differently to the different types of exercise. Then we design an appropriate one-factor experiment blocked by gender. So they kind of told you what you would do. You got one factor, which is going to be the exercise type, and 2 levels. Okay, so you're going to have swimming and weight training, or anaerobic and aerobic. And then blocked by gender, meaning we're going to run 2 parallel blocked experiments where we do the same experiment with the males as we do with the females. That way, if there was a significant difference between how the females responded to it versus the males or whatever, then we would see that separately, and we can remove variation in that difference between male and female, which is actually a good idea. So we want to start out with 120. We're going to block it by sex, so we're going to break them up to male and female. And then we randomly assign the males to weight training or swimming and the females to weight training or swimming. And when we're done, we compare their depression levels, whether it's 1 to 5 or whatever. So just rates of depression or levels of depression or average level of depression. And pretty much that's it. All right, in the experiment in part D, would it be possible to make the experiment double blind? So first, blind is obvious. That's going to be the person who's a part of it. Now, in this case, is it possible we're randomly assigning them to 2 different treatment groups? Are they going to know if they're swimming or if they're weightlifting? Clearly they are. So you can't actually blind them in that way. And then is it possible to be double blind? So the person who's evaluating, again, they're evaluating themselves. So they're going to know their depression levels, and they're going to know what kind of exercises they were doing. So I'm not sure it's possible for this experiment to be blinded at all. So if somebody favored one type of exercise over the other and they wanted to skew the results, then they very well could. They could report that their depression wasn't as bad when they were swimming, even though it really was, just because they wanted to. So yeah, you really can't you can't single or double blind in this case. It's kind of interesting. All right, 40, gas mileage. Do cars get better gas mileage with premium instead of regular? So we're talking about the octane levels in gasoline. Higher octane levels are premium, and the lower octane, like 87 that we commonly use, and just regular unleaded gasoline would be a lower octane. All right, it might be possible to test some engines in a laboratory, but we'd rather use real drivers with their own cars and real everyday, day-to-day driving. So we get 20 volunteers. What are the subjects of the experiment? So who are we using? In this case, the subjects would be the participants, which would be our 20 volunteers. We wouldn't call them subjects or experimental units because they're people. We would just call them participants. What are the factors we're testing and how many levels? So the factors we're testing is the grade or the octane grade or the fuel type. The levels we would have two. So we have premium and regular, which probably 87 and 80 or 91 or 93 or something like that, but they didn't specify the octane level, just premium and regular. So there's two levels. There's no real null here. You can't have like no gasoline, that doesn't work. List 3 outside factors that might affect miles per gallon that we should control. So one of them would be the type of vehicle. Okay, so bigger, heavier vehicles are going to have worse fuel economy. Okay, so we want to make sure we keep the type of vehicle consistent. Even though they're using their own vehicle, there's a way to do that with matching them up. So we have the same driver that drives their same vehicle, and then they drive it for a month with unleaded and then a month with premium gas. And then we can compare those two, right? So the driver, they're going to have variations from driver to driver, variations from vehicle to vehicle. The routes that they're doing, are they driving the same routes with both of them, or some people driving more on the highway, and then when they do the other test, they drive more in the city. Also, the weather changes miles per gallon. So when it's colder outside, you actually have better compression difference between like the beginning and the end temperatures. So you actually get better fuel economy when it's cold, even though it's worse wear on the engine when startup and stuff like that. All right, D, if we randomly assign the type of gas to 20 volunteers with separate cars and compare the average fuel economy with volunteers given regular and the premium gas, we would have a lot of variation due to the type of car. So if somebody had terrible fuel economy in a big old Hummer or something like that, if they were assigned to the premium group, they would make premium look really bad, just that one person, that variation. So what we want to do, so how might we block the experiment to reduce the variation? We could block the experiment where we separate them by car type. So we run them with all the people with sedans, all the people with vans, and all the people with trucks and SUVs or something like that. So that would separate those out, and we can see, okay, so which one benefits the most with premium or unleaded? Is it sedans, is it trucks and SUVs, or is it vans, something like that? All right, how might we make the experiment single blind? So single blind would be that the participant themselves doesn't know what type of gas they're using. So that just means we fill it up for them. That's pretty easy to be done. Is double blinding necessary? Well, who's evaluating in this case? The person, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. How far did they go with how many gallons of gasoline? So I don't think it's necessary to be double blind. They actually have the participant themselves keeping the logs of how far they went and how much fuel they used. So there's really no reason to double blind in this case. And the way to reduce the variation in the experiment, still allow the volunteers to use their own vehicles, would be designing an experiment matched by each volunteer. So this is using matched word, which usually we like to match with observations because we're matching up people who are in similar demographics or categories to see if we can reduce variation and kind of isolate some of the variables in that case. So we're going to match them. So we're going to run the same experiment with the same person twice. So we have them, they're the same vehicle, same person running premium then regular, and then regular then premium. And the reason we want to switch them and not just have everyone do regular first and then premium next is, let's say that the weather changes. So for regular, it's really hot, and then we get closer to the winter or a cold front comes in whenever they test the premium, and everyone's getting better fuel economy because of the weather. So that would be kind of a lurking variable that would, or confounding actually, that would, because of a poor design in the experiment, we weren't able to really isolate and make sure that it was the premium that was increasing the miles per gallon and not some other outside factor like the weather. All right, so we're going to randomly assign the drivers. We're matching them by driver, so they're going to be the same driver doing premium then for a month, and then regular gasoline for a month. Or group 2 will do regular first and then repeat it with the premium, and then we compare the miles per gallon from the two groups and from each individual match 1. So we would subtract the premium minus the regular for all 20 of the volunteers, and we take those numbers, whether they're positive or negative, and then we compare them that way. So there was an average increase of 4 miles per gallon across the board for all participants and all different vehicle types for premium or something like that. Would be how we report our results. All right, in the design described in part G, it's not part G, it was part F. I think I fixed that on yours. But why must the drivers be blinded about the fuel type assigned to them? Well, if you told me I had premium gas, and I might floor it more. I might try to have fun, with more horsepower or something like that. Or if I wanted to skew the results and I knew what type I was, let's say I wanted people to buy premium because I have stocks in gasoline or whatever, and petrol, or however you call it, then maybe I would report things differently and try to skew the results. So it's important that they don't know what type of fuel they have, so that they don't change the way that they drive and then bias our results towards one thing or the other. All right, so just over 30 minutes, so not too bad. A lot of explanations there. Again, I understand experiments can be difficult. There's you could take a whole course on designing experiments. We're just going into some of the basic stuff. Hopefully you picked up some of the trends going on here. And even myself personally, I'm learning a lot more about experiments and how to design them better, and a lot of vocab and using that stuff. So anyway, I'll see you guys later. Let me know if you have any questions.